fiery Italian warrior, sword in hand, storms into a grand palace. His target? The most powerful man in the world, the Pope himself. In a moment that stunned history, one man dared to do the unthinkable. He slapped the Pope across the face. This isn't just a story, it's a true tale of revenge, power, and a clash that changed the world forever. Who was this bold rebel? Why did he do it? And what happened after the slap heard around the globe? Get ready, because we're diving into the epic showdown between Sciarra Colonna and Pope Boniface VIII. By the way, this script wasn't generated by AI, it's crafted from careful research. Let us know in the comments, what story should we cover next? And where are you watching from? Chapter 1. The Colonna Grudge. In the shadow-draped halls of a crumbling villa on the outskirts of Rome, the year 1297 lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Sciarra Colonna, a nobleman whose very name carried the weight of his family's ancient glory, stood alone, his fists clenched until his knuckles gleamed white. His dark eyes, burning with a fire that no time could quench, stared out over the rolling hills toward the distant glow of the eternal city. The Colonna family, once lords of vast estates and wielders of unmatched influence, had been brought to their knees not by war or plague, but by the wrath of one man, Pope Boniface VIII. Sciarra's heart was a furnace of rage, each beat stoking a vow that had become his life's purpose to see the pontiff humbled, broken, and cast into the dust. The roots of his hatred stretched back to a bitter feud, one that had simmered for years before erupting into catastrophe. The Colonna, a clan as old as Rome itself, were no strangers to power. Their wealth and armies rivaled kings, their voices swayed popes, and their pride was a blade honed sharp. But Boniface, a man of ruthless ambition, cloaked in papal robes, would tolerate no rivals. When Sciarra's kinsman, proud and defiant, dared to question his authority, whispering of simony and tyranny, the Pope's response was swift and merciless. In 1297, he declared the Colonna traitors to the church, accusing them of plotting against him. His words were not mere condemnation, they were a declaration of war. With the stroke of a quill, Boniface excommunicated the entire Colonna family, casting them out of Christ's grace. Their lands, sprawling across the hills of Lazio, were stripped away, their titles reduced to ashes. Worst of all was the fate of Palestrina, the Colonna's ancestral stronghold. Boniface, unrelenting, sent his armies to raze it. The once mighty fortress, its towers piercing the sky, was reduced to rubble, its people scattered or slaughtered. Sciarra, then a young man of fiery spirit, had stood amidst the ruins, the acrid smoke of his family's legacy stinging his eyes. The Pope's soldiers mocked him as they tore down the walls, but Sciarra's silence was not surrender, it was the forging of a vendetta. He swore, under the blood-red sun, that Boniface would pay. Now, years later, in the fading light of 1303, Sciarra moved through the world like a man possessed. His once lustrous armor was scarred, his wealth diminished, but his hatred burned brighter than ever. The Colonna name, though tarnished, still commanded loyalty among the disaffected nobles of Italy, men who chafed under Boniface's iron grip. Sciarra's villa, a shadow of its former grandeur, became a gathering place for these outcasts, knights, mercenaries, and exiles who whispered of rebellion. Each night, as he paced the cold stone floors, Sciarra's mind churned with visions of the Pope's downfall. He imagined Boniface, that haughty old man with his jeweled tiara, kneeling in disgrace, his power shattered. It was a dream that kept him alive, a smouldering fuse waiting for the spark to ignite it. In the distance, Rome's domes glimmered under the stars, a reminder of the prize and the enemy. Sciarra's spies brought tales of Boniface's latest outrages, taxes on the clergy, decrees claiming supremacy over kings, and a new bull, Unam Sanctum, that declared all must bow to Rome. To Sciarra, it was proof of the Pope's arrogance, a challenge that could not go unanswered. As he sharpened his sword by candlelight, The blade's edge caught the glow, reflecting his resolve. The world knew Sciarra Colonna as a man of fire and fury, but none could guess how close he stood to a moment that would shake the heavens. What spark would finally light his vengeance, and what storm would it unleash? Chapter 2. The plot to humiliate. In the shadowed heart of a crumbling Roman villa, the summer of 1303 pulsed with the heat of conspiracy. Sciarra Colonna, his lean frame taut with barely contained fury, stood across from a man whose presence was as sharp as a drawn blade, Guillaume de Nogaret, the cunning lawyer of King Philip IV of France. The air between them crackled, thick with mutual ambition and shared hatred for a common enemy, Pope Boniface VIII. Nogaret, his dark eyes glinting like polished obsidian, spoke in a voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. "Boniface claims to rule kings," he said, unfurling a map of Anagni's hills. "We will drag him from his throne and show the world his frailty." Sciarra's lips curled into a wolfish grin, his heart ablaze with the promise of vengeance. The fuse of his grudge had found its spark. Nogaret was no ordinary ally. A man of cold intellect and ruthless precision, he served Philip the Fair, a king locked in a bitter struggle with Boniface over the Pope's audacious claim of supremacy. Boniface's bull, *unam sanctum*, had declared all rulers subject to Rome, a direct affront to Philip's sovereignty. The French king, unwilling to bow, had branded Boniface a heretic and tasked Nogaret with a mission as daring as it was blasphemous, to seize the Pope himself. Nogaret saw in Sciarra the perfect partner, a nobleman whose personal vendetta against Boniface burned hotter than any political grievance. The Colonna's humiliation at Palestrina, their lands razed, their name cursed by papal decree, made Sciarra a man who would stop at nothing. "Join me," Nogaret urged, his words a siren's call. "And we will make Boniface kneel." The plan was as bold as it was perilous. They would storm the papal palace in Anagni, a fortified hilltop town 50 miles southeast of Rome, where Boniface resided in the Caetani family's stronghold. Nogaret's strategy was meticulous. Infiltrate the town, overwhelm its defences, and arrest the Pope, dragging him to France to face a sham trial for heresy. Sciarra cared little for trials. His vision was simpler, bloodier. He wanted Boniface humiliated, his tiara torn from his brow, his pride crushed before the world. The thought of confronting the man who had burned Palestrina to ash set Sciarra's blood racing, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. "He will beg for mercy," Sciarra growled, "and find none." By the 6th of September 1303, the conspiracy took shape under a moonless sky. Sciarra and Nogaret gathered a force of 2,000 men, a formidable host of Colonna loyalists, battle-scarred mercenaries, and French soldiers loyal to Philip's gold. In hidden camps among Lazio's rugged hills, they sharpened blades and whispered oaths, their resolve hardened by tales of Boniface's tyranny. Sciarra's men, many of whom had lost kin or lands to the Pope's wrath, burned with the same fire as their leader. Nogaret, ever the chessmaster, ensured every detail was in place. Bribes for Anagni's guards, maps of its winding streets, and a plan to strike at dawn. As night fell, the army moved, a silent serpent winding through the valleys toward Anagni's wall. The town slept, unaware of the storm gathering at its gates. Sciarra rode at the forefront, his armor glinting faintly in the starlight, his thoughts a whirlwind of rage and anticipation. Nogaret, cloaked in a pilgrim's guise to mask his identity, rode beside him, his mind calculating every risk. The palace loomed in their sights, a fortress of stone and arrogance, housing the man who had dared to challenge kings and crush noble houses. As they neared Anagni's gates, the air grew heavy, the silence broken only by the soft clink of steel and the distant bark of a village dog. Sciarra's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the certainty of retribution. Yet, as the first lights of the town flickered into view, a shadow of unease crept over the host. Boniface was no ordinary foe, and Anagni no ordinary prize. What awaited them within those walls, divine wrath or mortal triumph? Chapter 3. The palace breached. As dawn broke over Anagni on the 7th of September 1303, the papal palace stood like a sentinel atop the hill, its ancient stones bathed in the pale light of a new day. But the quiet was a lie, shattered by the sudden roar of 2,000 men surging through the town's breached gates. Guillaume de Nogaret, his face a mask of steely focus, directed the assault with the precision of a maestro, while Sciarra Colonna, a tempest of rage, led the charge, his sword gleaming like an extension of his vengeance. Their army, Colonna loyalists, French soldiers and mercenaries swarmed the palace's outer defences, their war cries splitting the morning air. The Caetani guards, caught off guard and hopelessly outnumbered, scattered like leaves before a storm. Some surrendered, dropping their weapons in terror. Others fell beneath a hail of steel, their blood staining the cobblestones. The gates groaned, splintered, and gave way, and the invaders poured into the palace like a flood through a broken dam. Sciarra's mailed boots thundered through the stone corridors, the echo of his steps a drumbeat of retribution. His men followed close, their torches casting jagged shadows on the walls, illuminating tapestries and sacred relics now doomed to witness sacrilege. The palace, a labyrinth of vaulted halls and spiraling stairs, was no match for Sciarra's fury. He knew these paths not from maps, but from the stories of his kin, who had once dined here as allies before Boniface's betrayal. His heart burned with the memory of Palestrina's ruins, the ashes of his family's honor, and the excommunication that had branded him an outcast. "Find him!" he bellowed, his voice a raw wound, as he hacked through a wooden door barring his way. The Pope, the man who had taken everything, was close, so close, Sciarra could almost taste the triumph. In the great hall, Pope Boniface VIII, 73 years old, but unbowed, sat enthroned like a king of heaven. His papal regalia gleamed the triple-tiered tiara, a crown of divine authority, his cope heavy with gold thread, and in his gnarled hands a cross held like a shield. Around him stood a dwindling band of loyal clerics and guards, their faces pale but resolute, clutching rosaries or swords. The distant clamour of the attack grew louder, shouts, the clash of steel, the crash of shattered oak. Boniface's eyes, sharp as flint, betrayed no fear. "Let them come," he declared, his voice ringing with the weight of centuries. "I am Christ's vicar, and I will not flee." His defiance was a beacon, but also a dare, challenging the intruders to cross a line no man had dared before. The hall's heavy doors burst open with a thunderous crack, and Sciarra stormed in, his armour spattered with the morning's violence. His eyes, wild with a decade's worth of hatred, locked onto Boniface, and for a moment time itself seemed to freeze. There he was, the man who had raised Palestrina, stripped the Colonna of their birthright, and cast them into exile. Sciarra's breath came in ragged bursts, his sword trembling in his grip, not from fear but from the overwhelming urge to strike. Behind him, Nogaret entered, his calm demeanour a stark contrast to Sciarra's fire. The lawyer carried a scroll, his weapon of choice, but his presence was no less menacing. The hall filled with their men, a circle of steel closing around the Pope's small retinue, the air thick with the scent of smoke and impending doom. Sciarra took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Boniface. "You?" he spat the word a curse. "Who burned my home, who cursed my blood, you will answer now." The Pope, unmoved, met his stare, his cross raised like a challenge. "Strike if you dare," Boniface said, his voice steady. "But know you strike God himself." The words hung heavy, a gauntlet thrown at Sciarra's feet. Nogaret, sensing the moment teetering toward chaos, raised a hand, his voice cutting through the tension. "We come to arrest you, Boniface, for crimes against the Church." But Sciarra's eyes burned with a darker intent, his hand tightening on his blade. Would his rage boil over into bloodshed, or would Nogaret's calculated plan hold sway? As the hall stood poised on the edge of violence, the torches flickered, casting shadows that danced like spectres of judgment. The Pope's defiance and Sciarra's vengeance collided, two forces too vast to coexist. What would break first, the man, the throne, or the fragile veil between mortal ambition and divine retribution? Chapter 4. The slap heard round the church. In the cavernous great hall of Anagni's papal palace, on the morning of the 7th of September 1303, time seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with the acrid scent of torch smoke and the metallic tang of blood. As Sciarra Colonna stood before Pope Boniface VIII, his chest heaving with a decade's worth of rage. The Pope, enthroned in resplendent regalia, his tiara, a beacon of divine authority, his cross clutched like a talisman, met Sciarra's gaze with unflinching defiance. The hall, ringed by armed men, was a powder keg, the silence broken only by the faint crackle of flames and the ragged breaths of those who knew they stood on the edge of history. Sciarra, his face twisted into a mask of fury, took a step closer, his mailed boots ringing on the stone floor. In that moment, the world narrowed to two men, one a prince of the church, the other a nobleman consumed by vengeance. Sciarra's hatred was a living thing, forged in the ashes of Palestrina, tempered by years of exile and disgrace. Boniface had taken everything: his family's lands, their honor, their place in Rome's ancient hierarchy. The excommunication of the Colonna clan, the razing of their stronghold, had left scars that no time could heal. Now, standing before the man who had orchestrated his ruin, Sciarra felt the weight of his vow to see Boniface brought low. His hand, some say sheathed in a mailed glove, others bare but calloused from years of wielding a sword, rose with the inevitability of a storm breaking. Without a word, he struck a sharp, resounding slap across the Pope's weathered cheek. The crack of flesh against flesh echoed like a thunderclap, silencing the hall. Clerics gasped, guards froze, and even Guillaume de Nogaret, standing nearby with his scroll of charges, flinched at the audacity of the act. Boniface, 73, and frail but unyielding, staggered slightly, the red mark blooming on his cheek, a stark contrast to his pale, regal features. Yet his eyes, sharp as ever, burned with a fire that no blow could extinguish. He straightened, clutching his cross tighter, and stared back at Sciarra, his silence more powerful than any rebuke. The slap was no mere act of violence. It was a deliberate insult, a calculated desecration meant to strip the Vicar of Christ of his sanctity. To Sciarra, it was justice, the first taste of revenge for Palestrina's ruins, for the Colonna name dragged through the mud. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. "You are no pope, but a man, and you will fall like one." The words dripped with venom, each syllable a dagger aimed at Boniface's pride. The room teetered on the brink of chaos. Nogaret, his lawyer's mind racing, stepped forward, his hand raised to restrain Sciarra's next move. "Enough," he barked, his voice cutting through the tension. He had come to arrest Boniface, to drag him to France for a trial that would legitimize their rebellion, not to see him martyred by a vengeful noble. But Sciarra's act had shifted the ground beneath them. The Pope's loyal clerics, their faces pale with shock, whispered prayers, while the handful of remaining guards gripped their weapons, torn between duty. The attackers, Colonna loyalists and mercenaries alike, watched with bated breath, some grinning at the Pope's humiliation, others uneasy at the blasphemy unfolding before them. Boniface, his cheeks still stinging, raised his head higher, his voice steady as stone. "You may strike my flesh, but you cannot touch my soul," he declared, his words a challenge to Sciarra's rage and Nogaret's ambition. The hall seemed to pulse with the weight of his defiance, the air heavy with the clash of mortal hatred and divine authority. Sciarra's hand twitched toward his sword, his eyes blazing with the urge to do more than humiliate. Nogaret, sensing the danger, moved closer, his scroll now a forgotten prop in a drama, spiraling beyond his control. Would Sciarra's fury erupt into blood? Or would Boniface's unyielding resolve turn this act of sacrilege into something far greater? As the torches cast their flickering shadows, the hall stood frozen, a tableau of vengeance and defiance. The slap had echoed beyond Anagni, a sound that would reverberate through the church for centuries. But what would follow retribution, submission, or a darker fate? The great hall of Anagni's papal palace, once a sanctuary of divine authority, had become a crucible of chaos on the 7th of September 1303. The sharp crack of Sciarra Colonna's slap against Pope Boniface VIII's cheek still seemed to linger in the air, a wound that reverberated beyond the stone walls. Sciarra, his face alight with the savage triumph of vengeance, stood over the Pope, his mailed fist trembling with the urge to do more. Boniface, his tiara askew but his eyes blazing with unyielding defiance, clutched his cross as if it could shield him from the storm. The hall, crowded with Colonna loyalists, French soldiers, and mercenaries, buzzed with tension, the air thick with the scent of sweat and torch smoke. Guillaume de Nogaret, his lawyer's composure fraying, barked orders to restrain Sciarra's men, but the assault was far from over. The man who had raised Palestrina would not escape so easily. Sciarra, driven by a decade of festering hatred, seized the moment. With a roar, he lunged forward, his men following like hounds unleashed. They dragged Boniface from his throne, the golden cope tearing as he was pulled to the floor. The Pope, 73 and frail, refused to beg, his silence a rebuke more powerful than any cry. Sciarra's followers jeered, their voices a cacophony of insults, calling him heretic, usurper, devil. Some spat at his feet, others tore relics from the walls, desecrating the sacred space. Nogaret, his plan for a legal arrest unraveling, shouted for order, but Sciarra's rage was a wildfire, uncontainable. The Pope was hauled through the palace's corridors, his regalia mocked, and locked in a small chamber, its stone walls cold and bare. For 3 days, Boniface endured captivity, his captors' taunts echoing through the door. Sciarra's slap remained the centerpiece of his shame, a deliberate insult that stripped the Vicar of Christ of his sanctity, branding him a mortal man in the eyes of his enemies. Each day, Sciarra visited the imprisoned Pope, his presence a spectre of vengeance. "You burned my home," he snarled, his voice low and venomous. "Now you know ruin." Boniface, though weakened, met his gaze, his prayers unbroken, his spirit a fortress no indignity could breach. The townsfolk of Anagni, loyal to the Caetani, whispered in the streets, their fear giving way to outrage. By September 9, their murmurs became a roar. The citizens, armed with pitchforks, clubs, and righteous fury, rallied against the invaders. Sciarra and Nogaret, their forces depleted by desertions and the chaos of their own making, were caught off guard. The narrow streets of Anagni became a battlefield, the townsfolk's shouts drowning out the clatter of swords. Outnumbered and facing a tide of resistance, Sciarra and his allies fled, their banners trailing in the dust as they retreated into the hills. Boniface, freed by his people, emerged from his prison, a shadow of the man he had been. His cheek still bore the faint mark of Sciarra's blow, his body weakened by hunger and humiliation. Yet his eyes burned with a fire that death itself could not quench. He returned to Rome, a broken man but still a pope, only to succumb a month later on the 11th of October 1303. Some said it was fever, others whispered of a heart shattered by shame. Sciarra, meanwhile, fled to France under Philip IV's protection, his vengeance complete. The slap, that singular act of defiance, had etched his name into history not as a hero, but as the man who dared strike a pope. In the courts of Europe, men spoke of it in hushed tones, a sacrilege that shook the church's foundations. As Sciarra rode north, the wind at his back and the shadow of Anagni fading, he carried the weight of his triumph and its cost. Boniface was dead, but the echoes of that slap would haunt Christendom, a wound that time could not heal. What legacy would Sciarra's vengeance leave, and what new storms would rise from the ashes of Anagni? To be continued.